Right now, across the map of the United States, something is unfolding that looks, at first glance, like a handful of unrelated headlines. A heat wave here, a line of storms there, a quiet mention of the tropics tucked into the corner of a forecast graphic. But if you step back and look at the whole picture at once, you start to see that these aren't separate stories at all. They're pieces of a single, tightly connected weather pattern, one that is about to stretch across the middle of the country and grip it for the better part of a week. On one side of this pattern, a dome of brutal heat is settling over the nation's midsection, the kind of heat that can push thermometers toward 115 degrees. On the other side, a corridor of severe thunderstorms is lining up to hammer many of those same regions, day after day, with damaging wind, large hail, and a tornado threat that is quietly climbing with each passing hour. And sitting quietly behind both of these headline threats is a third detail that almost nobody is talking about yet. One small, easy-to-miss signal that could be the difference between a forecast that stays merely serious and one that turns genuinely dangerous within the next few days. If you want to understand exactly what's coming, where it's headed, and why meteorologists are watching this particular setup so closely, stay with me, because I'm going to walk you through the entire picture piece by piece. And if breakdowns like this are useful to you, go ahead and subscribe now so you don't miss what happens as this pattern develops. Let's get into it. Before we get into the day-by-day details, it helps to picture the shape of this pattern in the simplest possible terms, because once that shape clicks into place, everything else about this forecast makes sense. Imagine a giant dome of hot air parked over the central and southern plains, refusing to budge. That dome behaves almost exactly like a lid on a pot. It traps heat underneath it, and it forces the atmosphere around its edges to do something with all that trapped energy. Along those edges, where the hot, humid air underneath the dome collides with cooler, more active air pushing in from the north and west, the atmosphere begins to churn. That churn is exactly where the storms are firing. So while places like Kansas and Oklahoma bake under punishing, dangerous heat, the northern edge of that very same system becomes a factory for severe thunderstorms. That's the fundamental tension sitting at the heart of this forecast, and it's why one part of the country is desperate for shade and shelter from the sun, while another part, just a few hundred miles away, is bracing for repeated rounds of dangerous, organized storms. This is also why a forecast like this can feel confusing if you're only hearing pieces of it. Someone in Wichita is worried about heat exhaustion. Someone in Milwaukee is worried about their basement flooding or a tree coming down on their roof. Both concerns are valid, and both are being generated by the exact same weather system, just from opposite sides of it. Let's start with what's happening right now, because the first punch of this pattern is already landing. The Storm Prediction Center has outlined several zones of concern across the country for today. The largest of these stretches across the upper Great Lakes, running from the upper peninsula of Michigan through Wisconsin and back into Iowa and northern Missouri. Alongside that zone, there's an enhanced area of concern near the mid-Atlantic corridor, roughly in the neighborhood of Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, with a lower-level threat extending up into southern New England and down toward northern Virginia. For most of these areas, the number one danger today is straight-line damaging wind, the kind of sudden, powerful gust that can snap tree branches, topple entire trees onto power lines, and leave neighborhoods sitting in the dark for hours, sometimes longer. Large hail is also on the table, especially across the high plains and into South Dakota and Nebraska, where thunderstorms tend to grow tall and intense at this time of year, fueled by strong instability in the atmosphere. Now, here's where I want to be honest with you, because part of my job is relaying what the official outlooks say, and part of it is telling you what I'm personally watching in the data. Even though today's severe risk across the Midwest looks modest on paper, I don't think the tornado threat is truly zero. It's low, but it isn't nothing. I'm keeping a close eye on a corridor running from around Des Moines up toward central Wisconsin, and the Minneapolis metro area could be brushing up against the edge of that same low-end tornado zone. The reason for this concern is subtle but important. As we move into the late afternoon and early evening, the low-level winds across this corridor are expected to strengthen and shift direction. When that happens, even an ordinary-looking thunderstorm, one that looks unremarkable on radar, can briefly begin to rotate. That's exactly the kind of setup that catches people off guard because it doesn't look dramatic until it suddenly is. That's why, if you live anywhere in that region, today is a good day to make sure you have a reliable way to receive weather alerts, whether that's a smartphone with emergency alerts enabled, a dedicated weather radio, or a trusted local broadcast source. It costs you nothing to be prepared, and in the right moment, it can make all the difference between a close call and a tragedy. But today is only the opening act, and I want to be very clear about that, because the real story of this pattern isn't found in any single day. It's found in the relentlessness of the whole sequence. This isn't one storm system that rolls through, clears out, and leaves calm weather behind it. This is a pattern that keeps reloading, night after night, day after day. Understanding why it keeps reloading is the key to understanding everything that follows. So let's talk about the mechanism driving all of this, because once you understand the engine, you can basically see the next several days coming before they even arrive. The main driver here is a shift in the winds, both high above our heads and closer to the surface, and both of those wind fields are about to strengthen dramatically across the Midwest, the Great Lakes, and the Ohio Valley. There's a low-pressure system parked well to our north, up into Canada, and because of exactly where it's sitting, it's about to send a strong flow of air pushing down out of the northwest across the northern half of the country. When upper-level winds and lower-level winds both crank up like this at the same time, and you add in plenty of atmospheric moisture along with a highly unstable air mass, you get one of the textbook recipes for severe weather. There's going to be an enormous amount of energy available for storms to feed on, and on top of that energy, there's going to be significant wind shear, which is simply the technical term for the change in wind speed and direction as you move higher into the atmosphere. Shear matters because it's what allows an individual thunderstorm to organize itself, to tilt, and in the most extreme cases, to begin rotating. Think of instability as the fuel and shear as the structure. When you have generous amounts of both in the same place at the same time, storms don't just pop up randomly and fizzle out within 20 minutes. Instead, they build, they organize into more coherent systems, and they can turn dangerous very quickly. Here's the twist that makes this particular pattern so interesting to watch. Even though the winds are coming primarily out of the northwest for much of this setup, the picture starts to change as we head toward the weekend. By Sunday, the flow aloft is expected to become more westerly. That shift matters enormously because it allows the low-level winds closer to the ground to start pulling up out of the south. When winds near the surface are coming from the south, while winds higher up in the atmosphere are coming from the west, you create exactly the kind of turning, twisting wind profile that supercell thunderstorms thrive on. A supercell is the most organized and potentially the most dangerous type of thunderstorm there is, the kind capable of producing very large, damaging hail and strong, long-track tornadoes. So if the atmosphere comes together the way some of the current model guidance is suggesting, Sunday could carry a genuine, serious tornado threat across parts of the upper Midwest. I want to be careful with how I phrase this, because I'm not telling you this. Outcome is guaranteed. What I'm telling you is that the necessary ingredients are lining up in the data, and that is exactly the kind of setup you don't want to ignore 3 days out, even while there's still meaningful uncertainty in the details. Let me lay out the timeline as clearly as I can, day by day, so you know exactly what to watch for as the week progresses. The main action is concentrated across the Midwest and along the East Coast. We already have showers and thunderstorms bubbling up across Minnesota and Iowa this morning, and this activity is expected to become more widespread through the late morning and into the afternoon. Damaging. Wind is the primary concern, with isolated large hail also possible in the strongest cells. As mentioned earlier, I wouldn't completely rule out a brief, isolated tornado once those low-level winds ramp up in the late afternoon and early evening hours. Along the East Coast, scattered storms are expected to fire during the afternoon, starting near Cleveland and Columbus around midday and spreading eastward through the evening hours. The main danger in that corridor is pockets of damaging wind, with gusts that could reach around 70 miles per hour in the strongest storms, along with some small hail. The tornado risk there is very low. This looks like the quietest day of the entire stretch, and it's worth saying that plainly, because not every day inside an active pattern turns into a blockbuster event. I'm not expecting a widespread severe weather outbreak on Saturday. Instead, the main focus shifts to the interior northeast, primarily Pennsylvania and New York, where scattered storms could bring gusty winds and isolated hail during the afternoon hours. Out of every day in this forecast, Sunday carries the highest ceiling, and that's a phrase I keep coming back to because it matters. When I say a day has a high ceiling, I mean that the potential outcome could be significant, even though the most extreme version of that outcome isn't guaranteed to happen. Sunday is exactly that kind of day. This is when the upper level and lower level winds ramp up together across the upper Midwest. That strong flow sets in, the winds turn with height in just the right way, and the atmosphere becomes loaded with both instability and shear simultaneously. If storms manage to organize inside that environment, tornadoes are absolutely on the table as a realistic outcome, not just a theoretical one. Here's how Sunday could realistically play out. The morning may start quietly, with just a few scattered showers and storms, nothing alarming on its own. But watch the afternoon closely, because that's when 1 or 2 supercells could begin to develop. The parameters that meteorologists use to measure tornado potential are expected to climb sharply across parts of South Dakota, all the way into southern Wisconsin. The instability numbers involved here are genuinely eye-opening. We're talking about atmospheric energy that could reach 4,000, even 5,000 units in spots across Minnesota and Iowa. To put that in plain terms, that represents a tremendous amount of fuel, sitting in the atmosphere, waiting to be tapped. When the atmosphere is primed to that degree, and the wind fields are that favorable for organization, storms don't need much of an excuse to explode into intensity. If that scenario unfolds, cities like Milwaukee, Grand Rapids, and possibly even Detroit could be dealing with severe storms overnight and into early Monday, with damaging wind as the primary threat, and hail along with 1 or 2 tornadoes possible earlier in the cycle before the storms consolidate into that broader line. I want to keep repeating one particular word here, and that word is could. We are still a few days out, and this is genuinely one of the trickier stretches of the year to forecast severe weather with precision. July and August are notoriously difficult months because so much of the outcome depends on small-scale details that simply don't fully reveal themselves until the day actually arrives. So I'm giving you the honest picture. The potential is real and the ceiling is high, but the exact outcome is still meaningfully uncertain. I'd rather you understand that nuance than walk away with false certainty in either direction. Either this is definitely happening or this is nothing to worry about. Now, let me pause here for a moment because I'm genuinely curious about something. Have you ever lived through one of these overnight lines of severe storms? The kind that roll through in the dark, when all you can really do is hear the wind and watch the lightning flicker through the windows? Drop a comment and tell me where you were and what that experience was like, because those overnight events are some of the most underestimated severe weather scenarios out there, and I think a lot of people don't fully realize how disorienting they can be until they've actually lived through one themselves. And here's where a second, quieter danger starts to emerge, one that doesn't get nearly the same attention as tornadoes, but can be every bit as destructive in its own right. When you get several rounds of storms training repeatedly over the same areas, day after day, all of that rainfall starts to add up, and flooding becomes a serious concern. This is one of the things I'm watching most closely heading into the middle of next week across the Ohio Valley. One of the major forecast models has been hinting at a widespread 3 to 7 inches of rain across that region, with some spots potentially seeing even higher totals than that. That's a striking signal because that particular model doesn't typically paint such heavy rainfall totals across such a broad area, which tells me the atmosphere may genuinely be primed to wring out a tremendous amount of moisture over a relatively short period. At the same time, another leading global model is noticeably more conservative, showing a broader area of 1 to 3 inches of rain rather than those extreme totals. The disagreement between models matters, and it's exactly why I'm not going to sit here and tell you that major flooding is a done deal. But when one reliable model is flashing numbers that high over a heavily populated region, it's the kind of signal you pay close attention to. Let me step back now and talk about the other half of this pattern, because the storms are genuinely only telling half the story here. The other half is the heat, and it is brutal. While the northern tier of the country deals with severe weather, the central and southern plains remain trapped underneath that dome of hot air I described at the very start. The numbers involved are the kind that genuinely stop you in your tracks. We're looking at high temperatures, pushing toward 115 degrees across parts of southern Kansas and northern Oklahoma. That figure isn't a heat index number or a feels like calculation. That's the actual air temperature. This is exactly the point in the forecast where I want to remind everyone that heat is consistently one of the deadliest forms of extreme weather in this country. Even though it never generates the dramatic footage that tornadoes and hurricanes do, no swirling funnel clouds, no satellite spirals, it tends to sneak up on people in a way those other hazards don't. If you're anywhere in that region over the coming days, check on elderly neighbors and relatives. Never leave anyone or any pet inside a parked car, even briefly. Hydrate constantly throughout the day and take every heat warning seriously. This level of heat simply isn't something to try to tough out through willpower alone. Now, here's a detail I genuinely find fascinating about this entire pattern, because it shows just how dramatically the atmosphere can swing within a single week. After that heat finally peaks, a strong cold front is expected to sweep through the Midwest and Great Lakes region by around the middle of next week, and the temperature reversal that follows is dramatic, to put it mildly. Low temperatures across Minnesota and Wisconsin could dive back down into the 50s and 40s, and in a few spots across northern Minnesota, even into the 30s. Now let that sink in for a moment. We're talking about the real possibility of 30-degree readings in a region that, just days earlier, was part of a country baking near 115 degrees. For anyone growing crops up in the northern reaches of Minnesota, those chilly overnight readings are genuinely worth watching, because cold-like, that at this particular point in the growing season can raise real agricultural concerns. The good news, at least for now, is that it doesn't look like temperatures will drop all the way down to freezing anytime soon, so a hard freeze isn't currently in the immediate cards. Still, it's a useful reminder of just how quickly the season can turn once one of these major pattern shifts gets going in earnest. That's still a long way out, and far from certain at this stage, but it fits neatly into the broader theme here of a persistently active pattern that simply doesn't seem to want to quit. This is one of those stretches of the year where the atmosphere appears locked into a rhythm, and once it finds that rhythm, it can keep the storms coming for a week or more without much of a real break. There's one more piece of this national weather picture I want to touch on, because it's the part almost nobody's talking about right now, and it's genuinely unusual for this point in the calendar. The tropics, at the moment, are dead quiet, and I mean unusually quiet for this stage of the season. The Atlantic has produced almost nothing so far, and there's a very specific reason behind that silence. A strong El Niño pattern is currently in place, and El Niño tends to crank up wind shear across the Atlantic basin. That shear acts almost like a giant pair of scissors, tearing apart developing tropical systems before they ever get the chance to organize into something more serious. So while the Eastern and Central Pacific remain relatively active this season, the Atlantic sits unusually calm by comparison. For those of us here in the United States, that's obviously good news on its face. Fewer storms brewing out in the Atlantic means fewer immediate threats aimed at the coastline in the short term. But here's the catch, and it's an important one to understand. A quiet season is not automatically the same thing as a safe season. When the Atlantic has been this quiet for this long, all of that unused ocean heat energy keeps building up with essentially nowhere to go. So if a storm does eventually manage to break through those hostile, shear-filled conditions later in the season, it could tap into all of that stored oceanic energy and strengthen very quickly, potentially all the way up into a major hurricane in a short window of time. It really only takes one storm to change the entire narrative of a season. Let me try to bring all of these separate threads together now, because I think it's easy to get lost in the day-by-day details and lose sight of the bigger picture of what's actually happening across the country this week. What we have at its core is a country effectively split in two by a single dominant weather feature. That dome of heat sitting over the central and southern plains is the anchor of the entire pattern. Everything else revolves around it in one way or another. Its northern edge is where the jet stream and the broader storm track collide with all of that trapped heat and moisture, and that collision zone is exactly what's been producing the daily rounds of severe weather we've been discussing. As the winds shift and strengthen through the weekend, that collision zone becomes more organized and correspondingly more dangerous, which is precisely why Sunday stands out so clearly from the rest of the week. Then, as the whole system finally starts to break down, the cold front sweeps through, temperatures crash dramatically in its wake, and the heavy rain and flooding threat lingers behind it across the Ohio Valley. And through all of it, the tropics stay eerily silent, a quiet that carries its own hidden risk, even if that risk doesn't materialize for weeks or even months. That's the pattern in full. Not one isolated storm and not one isolated heat wave, but an entire orchestrated sequence, with each individual piece feeding directly into the next. That's genuinely what makes this particular stretch of weather stand out from an ordinary summer week. Most of the time, forecasters are tracking one major threat at a time. If you live anywhere across the Midwest, the Great Lakes, or the Ohio Valley over the next several days, treat every afternoon and evening as a period to stay weather aware. Keep your phone alerts turned on, have a backup way to receive warnings in case the power goes out during a storm, and know in advance where you'd take shelter if a warning were issued for your specific area, especially on Sunday, when that tornado potential is at its highest point of the week. If you're in the central or southern plains, your primary enemy is the heat. Plan any outdoor activity around the coolest parts of the day, stay hydrated consistently rather than only when you feel thirsty, and look out for the people around you who are most vulnerable to extreme heat: young children, elderly relatives and neighbors, and anyone working outdoors for extended periods. And if you're anywhere near where that flooding rain sets up in the middle of next week, remember one of the oldest and most important rules in severe weather safety: never drive into a flooded road. It takes a genuinely small amount of moving water to sweep a vehicle off the road entirely, and no shortcut home is ever worth that risk. I also want to be completely straightforward with you about the uncertainty involved here, because I think you deserve that honesty rather than false confidence. The details of this forecast, especially from Sunday onward, are still coming into sharper focus. Today's heat and today's storms, those I feel genuinely confident about. The Sunday severe threat has a high ceiling, but an outcome that remains uncertain. The flooding signal is concerning, but it isn't locked in yet, and the possibility of another system developing about a week out is a longer-range hint at this stage, nothing more concrete than that. As the days go on, some of these individual threats will grow more defined, while others may fade away entirely. I'll be here to update you every step of the way as the overall picture continues to sharpen. So before you go, I've got one more question for you, and I'd genuinely love to see your answers in the comments. Out of everything covered in this forecast, the extreme heat, the tornado threat, the flooding risk, or that strangely quiet tropical season, which one worries you the most and why? I read through the comments regularly. And it's genuinely fascinating to see what different regions of the country tend to worry about most, because it often depends entirely on where you live and what kind of severe weather you've personally been through before. And that's going to do it for this breakdown. If you found this helpful, if it made a complicated, fast-moving weather picture even a little bit clearer, do me a quick favor and hit that like button, because it genuinely helps more people find these forecasts right when they need them most. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you're among the first to know when the Sunday setup and everything that follows it comes into sharper focus. And of course, drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this community is honestly one of the best parts of doing this work.